Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. It's very nice to be back in Krakow again. Last time I was here was 2 years ago, and I really did miss your beer so much that I had to come back. Before we go any further, don't worry about writing loads and loads of notes for this, because the slides are already up on slideshare.net/ChrisDavidMills. So you can get all of this stuff there, as well as not needing to take notes. There's also a whole load of URLs inside the talk with, that will give you links to more details about all of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. And also, feel free to ask me questions afterwards. I am this big heavy metal guy, and I play drums in a heavy metal band, but I'm actually pretty friendly, so I'm kind of like a giant Labrador, really. So if you haven't the time to come and talk to me afterwards, either here or in the bar later on, please feel free to take my email addresses and my Twitter handle and ask me questions online too. So let's get this party started. A little bit about myself before we actually get into the main material. I work for Opera and W3C, kind of half and half between each. And I do a lot of messing about with open standards, noodling around with JavaScript and CSS and HTML, writing cool demos, giving information back to the spec teams, telling them what works and what doesn't, which is quite interesting. I'm also a complete accessibility whiner, so I look at all of these modern technologies, but I try to visualize how they can be used while still keeping accessibility alive, still making sure that all of those core values such as semantics are upheld as well. And then outside all of this stuff, I am a heavy metal drummer, as I mentioned earlier. And in this talk, I'm going to be really talking about CSS3 and how we can use it to achieve interesting layouts on web pages a lot more easily. So some of this stuff is usable now, some of this stuff won't be usable until a little while in the future. But I'll really look at what the current state of things is and what we can do now and how we can use stuff on newer browsers, but also use things like Modernizer to serve alternative layouts to older browsers that don't support this stuff. So a little bit of a history lesson now. Let's go back to the early days of the web. In the early days, a lot of us kind of thought that the web was print. Indeed, we borrowed a lot of the ideas of layout from print and tried to take them to the web, and it worked sometimes, but didn't work so well other times. I think another problem in the early days of the web is that a limited device landscape meant limited outlook, so we didn't have all of these different devices and all of this responsive design problem. So because of that, when the responsive design problem did come up, we weren't as well prepared to deal with it. And then we also had a very limited tool set in the early days. So let's say a little bit more about each of these. If you look at print design, it tends to mean the designer has full control. You can pretty much guarantee that the technologies will be supported, or should I say, the medium should be supported. You can guarantee that pretty much that the user can see your print design, as long as they're not blind. That tends to be a bit of a hurdle. And the canvases tend to be fixed. The web, on the other hand, the designer doesn't have any control, well, has much less control over how the user will see the output. You can't guarantee that the technologies will be supported, and the canvases are completely variable. You really can't guarantee what screen size or resolution or manufacturer or browser these users are going to be using. So you've got to design a lot more defensively. When talking about limited devices, back when the web first started, we didn't have all of these mobile devices and tablets to support. We really just had desktops and laptops of maybe 640 by 480, or if you were a really, really rich kid, 800 by 600. We've come a long way since then, of course. But limited devices meant a bit of a limited outlook. When it actually came to the time to do responsive design, we didn't have so much of an idea of how to do it, how to make our designs adapt across vastly differing screen sizes. And this meant that we were basically building a lot of fixed, inflexible designs. When the mobile web came along, we pretty much thought, well, the way to do this is to build completely separate sites for mobile devices, which of course was really silly, because then what happens when a lot of different brands of mobile device come along, different makes of mobile browser? What about tablets? Do we do a different site for every single one of these devices? Of course not, it just can't work. We also thought WAP was a good idea back in the day. Anybody here ever had to develop any WAP sites, WAP applications? Yeah, a few of you. I really feel for you guys. It was terrible. So on to the limited tool set point. Back in those days, we didn't have a good tool set for layout. There was HTML, but HTML didn't have any viable tools for layout. CSS came along soon after, which was fantastic, but CSS support didn't, or at least consistent CSS support. So we sat there and we thought, well, you know, we could absolutely pull all of our hair out and go crazy trying to make this thing work using CSS layouts across browsers, or we could just go back and use HTML tables and spacer GIFs, which I know is Brian's favorite. And when I hear about these sad stories, it makes me feel a bit like this. Consistent CSS support was great when it happened, but it was a long time later. It was probably early to mid-2000s before we could really start to rely on cross-browser CSS support, which is terrifying given that CSS first appeared in about 96 or 97. I think CSS2 first appeared in 98. They also started working on CSS3 modules not much longer than that. But even when CSS2 stuff had consistent support across browsers, it still didn't really give us much in the way of layout tools. If we look at it now, pretty much most of the stuff we do is floats. And floats are okay, but it's a bit of a hack, really, if you think about it, using floats for all of these multi-column layouts. It's not really what they were originally intended for. And they're abused kind of quite a lot. Positioning also gives us some interesting things we can do, but it has its limitations. And then we've got margins and padding and borders and not very much, really. We still have a raft of design problems that are absurdly difficult to solve with the tool set available in CSS2. You look at all of these kind of things and you think, well, you know, these are all reasonable things that we might have to do on a web page or a web application, but they're far more difficult and more illogical than they should be. If you consider something like centering stuff, trademark, if you've just got one single element that you want to center, you can use something like the margin zero auto trick. That's fairly simple, but what about if you want to center stuff but then also have it flexible and then also be able to have a background that just sort of shrink wraps around the content rather than going the whole width of everything? You've got to do something like this, which is not that complicated and it works, but why do we need that extra div inside there, and why do we have to align the text align center on the figure, but then do display inline block on the div to shrink wrap it around the actual content? You know, it works, but it's really absurdly complicated if you really think about it, you know, and illogical. Why do we have to do this? Same height columns is another classic one. This is like the holy grail of CSS layout problems. And of course, this is what's going to happen when you have floated columns inside a container. The longest, the column with the most content will go down further and the others won't reach that. And we can fix that again with something like the tried and tested faux columns technique, where you actually put the tiled background on the parent container rather than the columns themselves, making it look like they're the same height even though they're not. Or you could fix it with JavaScript. You know, you could probably grab the client height of the parent container and then just loop through all of the child columns and give them that same height, maybe removing a bit to account for the extra amount of padding that you don't want there. But should we need to do stuff like that? It's just crazy, really. Fortunately, we do have a new hope. Oh, I'm glad somebody got it. There are a lot of new tools on the horizon coming up. The CSS working group and the browser vendors have been working very hard to implement a lot of interesting new layout modules that we can actually use to do this layout stuff a lot easier and in a much less hackish sort of way. So the rest of the talk will run through a load of these new modules and what's available and what we can use now. So media queries. This appears like a good place to start, doesn't it? I'm not going to spend too much time on media queries because I think, well, most of us have got media queries by now. Even I understand this stuff, so it's, it's not that difficult. I'll just run through it very quickly just in case there's anybody out there that's not too sure. So the idea of media queries is that we don't have to make separate sites for each mobile or tablet that comes along to view our site. We can have exactly the same base of content and then optimize them for different layouts, depending on these media feature tests. So you do things like this. You'll say, I'll have my default layout here, but then I'll do a test to see if the width of the screen is 480 pixels or less, and if it is, we'll apply this CSS to give it a custom layout for screens of that size, or viewports of that size, should I say. But if not, we'll completely ignore those CSS rules. An even better way to do this is the opposite way round. Mobile first is a technique that a lot of people are using now, and the idea of this is that instead of having the default layout as the desktop or sort of average, desktop kind of layout, you have the default layout as the mobile layout. And then you have a bunch of media queries to add styles on the top of that to make for wider and wider screen layouts. And that's a lot more useful in a way, because it means that when you've got great big images that you want to include in your backgrounds for your desktop layout, a mobile layout would, using the first way round, the mobile phone would come to that site and then go, okay, so I have to download these enormous great images for the desktop first, and then after that I'll replace them with my mobile images. And it, in effect, downloads the resources twice, which is really bad for mobile, especially if you're on low bandwidth. With mobile first, you just download the resources for the mobile layout first, and then the mobile will completely ignore the desktop layout stuff. So that's a much better way round of doing it. And blah, blah, blah. You can do this kind of stuff with media queries. It's all very exciting. I'm not a designer, by the way. But less people have heard of this thing, match media. So match media is a construct that allows you to run media queries inside JavaScript. It's supported, again, in most modern browsers. Opera Presto doesn't have it, and neither does IE9 and below, but you can polyfill that. And this is the kind of thing that match media allows you to do. It's just a simple if-else conditional, and you basically just say, if this media query matches, then run this stuff for wider screens. If not, do stuff for narrow screens instead. So it's pretty simple, very useful. So next up, let's have a little look at viewport. Of course, the problem we've got with media queries, as great as they are, mobile browsers lie about viewport rendering width. When they render a website, they tend to go, well, I'm 480 pixels wide, but instead I'm going to render this site at 980 pixels and then shrink the result down to fit the mobile screen. And of course, this is a good defensive design idea by mobile browser manufacturers, because most of those non-responsive sites out there would look like complete crap if rendered at 480 pixels or 320 pixels. So it does make a lot of sense, but it's still a bit annoying when you, as as a modern responsible web designer, has built this decent site with lots of media queries, and you go, God damn it, I want this mobile phone to respect my media queries. I don't want my site to look like this, tiny, completely zoomed out, non-viewable site on mobile. So you can do this in the head of your HTML to basically say, okay, I don't want you to lie about the viewport width, I want you to render it using your real screen width. And then you'll get something more like this, so the media query will be respected. So I think most people know about this already as well. Less people have heard of this though. There's actually, there's a spec called CSS device adaptation. And this was written by a bunch of clever dudes at Opera and a clever guy at Adobe. And they basically looked at viewport and went, well, the viewport meta tag's a good idea, it's a really good idea, but surely viewport's much more of a style thing than an HTML thing, so why don't we do this in CSS instead? And that's what they did. So CSS device adaptation specifies this @viewport rule, which allows you to do exactly the same things inside CSS, basically. And it's got some other advantages. You could nest this inside a media query if you wanted to. So you could say, okay, I only want this viewport to come into effect when this media query is passed. And that's got some interesting possibilities as well. And there's some more information there. Next up, let's have a look at this thing, Flexbox. I think a lot of people have heard of Flexbox, but most people haven't really used it yet. This allows us to do much easier layout stuff and solves a lot of these stupid problems that we traditionally had, like same height columns and vertical centering and things that were just really hard with CSS2. I think it also cures cancer, but I'm not exactly sure about that. This is supported a bit disparately at the moment. The most modern Flexbox syntax is supported in Chrome and Opera Presto. The 2009 syntax, which has been completely changed since then, is supported in most browsers, pretty much except Opera. And then there was this weird hybrid Flexbox syntax, which is kind of a mix of the two, that was supported in IE10. And then, of course, it completely changed, and they aren't going to update it for ages. So not really a very good show by the IE team there. So I'll talk about a little bit more about making this stuff work in older browsers and falling back and working across all these systems later, but let's have a bit of a look at some details. So if we take an example of a simple layout with a section, parent container, and 3 child elements, in Flexbox, if we just do display flex, we'll basically say this section is now being laid out as a flexible box. It instantly gives us this. And yeah, this is a bit screwy and needs a bit of help to make it look like a good layout, but this is quite impressive because not only has it instantly given us columns, it's also given us same height columns as well. Now the reason this works is because the default value of the flex direction property when you set a box to be display flex is flex direction row. And that basically says, okay, I want my child elements to be displayed across the screen in a row. You can also do flex direction column if you want to have it displayed downwards in a column. And you can also make them do those things but in reverse direction by doing row reverse and column reverse. So Flexbox kind of breaks a lot of these traditional CSS box model rules and CSS layout model rules and just lets you do what you want. There's also a flex wrap property which allows you to say, okay, if the child elements of the Flexbox are sized such that they would overflow the parent, they'll instead wrap onto a new line to make it so that overflowing doesn't happen. And there's also flex flow property, which is shorthand for these two. One important concept to be aware of when you're dealing with Flexbox is main and cross axis. So when you choose flex direction row to lay out a bunch of Flexbox children in a horizontal manner, the main axis will be in the horizontal direction and vertical if you've chosen flex direction column. Then the cross axis is always the axis perpendicular to that main axis. And so you can do things like this. You can use the justify content property to say, I want to align my items differently along the main axis. So, I don't know if we can all see this very well, but I don't think we can, but never mind. So I've got 3 boxes there. If we use justify content flex start, it means it lumps them all at the beginning of the flex box. Center makes them all stuck in the center, and flex end makes them all go to the end. It's basically like aligning content in a word processor, exactly the same concept. And there's also some more interesting ones called space around and space between. If you use justify content space between, it divides the remaining space inside the parent container into equal amounts, and it puts an equal amount between each of your child elements. So it just spaces them out evenly, which is pretty cool. And then space around is slightly different. It also puts a bit of space around the 2 sides of the child elements. Then you can also align items on the cross-axis using the align items property. And again, it's the same concept, it's just in the other direction to the one that we just showed. So by default, this is align item stretch, which is why we get equal height columns on the example that I showed you earlier. But you can also say, okay, I want flex start to make my items all sit at the very top of the flex box, or align end makes them all glued to the bottom, center makes them all centered, etc., etc. So you've got a lot of options there. Another one of the sort of holy grail problems that Flexbox solves is changing the layout order of elements without messing with the source order and without messing with the DOM. This used to be a bit of a pain in the ass, but now you can use the order property. And the way this works is what you're doing is you're putting the child elements of the flexbox into ordinal groups. By default, they're all in ordinal group 0, and within each ordinal group, they just appear in the same order as the actual source order. But if you put them into a higher numbered ordinal group, so here I'm putting navigation into ordinal group 1, the higher numbers will appear later on than the earlier numbers, than the lower numbers. So if we do this, then navigation now just appears at the other end instead. And that's pretty useful. I mean, it's very common when you're doing a layout to want to reorder things dependent on media queries. So for example, when you've got a wide desktop layout, when you get down to a narrow layout, you probably don't want to have the navigation stuck up the top because you're using all of that screen space and you want the user to see the article or whatever is on the site quicker. So often a thing that people do is they'll put the navigation menu down the bottom of the page for the mobile layout, and you can really easily do it using this. So the next one we'll look at is flexing our muscle. Not going to divulge which muscle, but there you go. So the flex property is probably the coolest thing in Flexbox. This basically says, okay, you know, you can do things like say, I want all of the child elements just to expand to fill up the entire parent container, but I want them to share the available space equally. And that's brilliant because, you know, how many times have you been sat there with a CSS layout going, oh, I need to make this one 23.7842%, and I need to make this one 83.49%, and oh, it's fallen down to the bottom line, oh, it doesn't work in this browser, it's horrible. It's stupid to have to do that. But with the Flexbox and the Flex property, you can just say things like this. And the way it works is this is a unitless value. It's actually a proportion value. So the way to work out how much space each element will take up is to add together all of the proportions. So here, we have 2 articles and we have 1 nav. So that means 3 plus 3 plus 1 is 7. So we have 7 total proportion units. And so what will happen is each article element will take up 3/7 of the space available, and the navigation will take up 1/7 of the space available, giving us something more like that. But there's a lot more to this flex property than meets the eye. And this is where it starts to become a bit of a head trip. It's very hard to explain this stuff, so I will try. The value we've seen already inside the flex property is called flex grow. And flex is actually a shorthand property for flex grow, flex basis, and flex shrink. And flex grow is the one that we've already seen that dictates how much of the available space inside the parent the child elements will take up. Flex basis specifies an initial width to put those child elements at before you then apply the flex grow afterwards. So, for example, if we gave both our articles a flex basis of 400 pixels, they would both be set to 400 pixels first, but then the remaining space after those 400 pixels and any padding the elements have has been applied is then divided up according to the flex grow value. But it gets even more complicated than that. And this is like trying to explain the plot to Donnie Darko or Inception or something. The flex shrink value shares out the amount of, okay, when your child elements are sized so that they will overflow the parent and they're not going to wrap because flex wrap hasn't been set, the flex shrink value says, okay, this is the amount that they're overflowing the parent by. So the flex shrink value is also a proportion value, and this specifies the amount of overflow each element will be reduced by to bring the overall width back underneath so it won't overflow the parent anymore. Yeah, I think we'll leave that one there. I don't think you'll use that one that often. So to sort of wrap it up and show you a little bit about what you can do with Flexbox, I'll just have a quick look at a case study which ties all of this stuff together. So this is again the example I've been using all the way through the talk. But here what I've done is I'm still using flex direction row, but I've got this navigation now sat at the top there rather than down the side. And the way I've done that is I've set it to flex flow row wrap. So I've got flex direction row and flex wrap wrap. But then I've set the navigation to have a flex basis of 100%. So what that means is the navigation will always take up 100% of its parent element, but then the other elements will then fall down to a new line because of the row wrap. And then because they have the same flex grow value, they will then take up an equal amount of the space on that new line. So that's how you do that. Now, what I've also done is I've got this interesting flexible awesome navigation, and I'll just show you that in the actual browser. So when the screen width gets narrower, the navigation actually adjusts like that. And this is not using media queries or anything complicated, this is just Flexbox. So the way I've done this is as follows. When you turn an element into a Flexbox, you only flexibly lay out the immediate children of the Flexbox. It doesn't affect any further descendants down the hierarchy. But there's nothing to stop you from making the children Flexboxes themselves. You can pretty much do that infinitely for some very complicated layouts. So I've also made the nav a Flexbox and justify content center to make it stick in the center. I've also made the UL inside the navigation a Flexbox and set it to justify content center, so that also centers. I've set that to width 80%, so it doesn't quite reach all the way across it. And the next thing to do is the list items inside the UL, I've used Flex Auto and min width 5 rems. So Flex Auto is a special value of Flex, which basically says if you've got a minimum width of some kind set on your little boxes, it will respect that. So it won't size them further, it won't size them any less than the minimum width. But then if there is extra space for the boxes to grow into, they will then grow to fill that space. So that's how I achieved that. And that's kind of cool to be able to do stuff like this. And you can find some more on Flexbox there. Okay, the next trick that I'll discuss is the CSS multi-column module, or multicol, as it's commonly known as. This has got a very specific, very limited usage. It really is just for getting an element with a bunch of content in it and breaking them into multiple columns. Because, you know, in the past you've thought to yourself, I want to do a kind of a newspaper layout with multiple columns. But if you want to do that, you've got to have a separate container element for each one of those columns and then float them, and then if it's a flexible layout and you want the content to shift between the different columns depending on how wide they're going to be, you're screwed, it's not going to happen. But with multicol you can. So we can say things like column count. Here I've just got a single article with all of the content in. So if we do column count 2, it gives us 2 columns. And it will always be broken up into 2 columns regardless of how wide the parent element is. There's also a rule called column gap, which says, you know, how much space do you want in between each column. And then there's column rule, which allows you to set these vertical borders or rules between each column. And the column rule property and its longhand properties work in exactly the same as border does. But one thing you've probably looked at that, you've probably thought, well, it looks a bit sucky because you haven't got that second subheading at the top of the column. You can sort that out using column breaks. So there's break before and break after and break inside, which basically says, you know, do you want it to always break before or after or inside this element? Or do you want to always avoid breaking inside, before or after? So here I'm saying always break before, always do a column break before the H2, and that solves this problem. It is a bit tricky to work these out in more complex layouts, so I do advise just sticking to pretty simple stuff with multi-column. You can also specify that you want certain elements to span across all of the columns rather than just being stuck inside one column, and that's especially useful when you have a long heading and you don't just want it to be all crushed inside one column. So if you say column span all, it just makes those H2s go all the way across and then the stuff appears below them, so that's kind of cool. And then the other thing that I really like about multicol is instead of specifying column count and saying there will always be 3 columns, you can specify column width and say, okay, I always want my columns to be 30 rems or 50 rems or whatever it is, or 300 pixels. And the browser will then use a best fit approach. So the columns will probably never be exactly that width that you specify, but the browser will always go, okay, at the moment I have this amount of space, so I can fit 3 columns of about that wide in and still not leave a gap at the end. And then as you reduce the size of the element, as you can see from this example, you'll then get less columns. And again, it's a nice sort of responsive design feature without actually having to use any media queries. So that's pretty cool. Multiple columns do have a limitation, really, though. As I say, they're not very good for complex content. If you've got loads of images inside your content and loads of different heading levels, it will immediately start to look a complete mess, so you should think about doing it in a different way. And there's no way to specify the width of each individual column, so you can't do proper multiple column layouts with it. If you want to do something like that, you should use something else anyway, like flexbox or floats. The break properties are a bit fiddly, and then a lot of browsers don't support the column span all property that I showed you. In fact, Opera Presto was the only rendering engine that did support it until a while ago, and that's actually the very first patch that we've submitted to WebKit now that we've moved over to WebKit, which is pretty cool. Next, I'll have a very brief look at grids. This is probably another one that you've heard of floating around the interwebs. CSS grid layout module allows you to completely separate your content from the actual layout blocks and create an actual proper grid system natively. I haven't really played with this that much because it's only supported in IE10 at the moment, and the IE10 implementation is already out of date. The spec has already changed, so it wasn't really that good for them to implement it so early on. There's also concerns about the terminology used. Quite a few UK designers, in particular Mark Bolton, have written lots of very angry blog posts about the fact that the spec writers aren't really acknowledging and continue to use the hundreds of years old terminology that we've already got for grid systems. They're kind of shying away from it for some reason, so hopefully that argument will be resolved eventually. But basically the way we do it is this. You'll say, okay, I want my body to be laid out as a grid, so it's another special value of a display property. And then you specify how big you want your columns and your rows to be using grid columns and grid rows. And you can use any units you want for those. There's even a special new unit called FR, or fraction, which works in exactly the same way as the flexbox flex proportions. You know, it basically says, I want this column to be 1/5 of this whole thing, or 2/5 or whatever. And then you can put different contents into the different grid squares like this. So for example, with my header here, I've basically said, okay, I want the header to be starting in grid in the first column and the first row, but I want it to span across all 7 of my columns. And that will give you this. So this is pretty much the way it works. And yeah, this is kind of cool because it means that you can just have some completely non-semantic divs or something to stick your grid into, but then have your content laid out in nice proper semantic elements somewhere else, which is still pretty reasonable for accessibility because most screen readers just pretty much ignore divs anyway, and you can have the two completely separated. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next section. Regions. Regions is another spec which allows us to completely separate content from layout, and this has got slightly better support across browsers. This is now supported in IE10 and Chrome Canary, so you can pretty much play with it whatever system you're on. And what this does is it allows you to turn a bunch of containers into vessels to flow content into. You can basically say, okay, these boxes up here, I want my content to be flowed into those boxes. And then you specify your content somewhere else, and then you flow it into those boxes. And again, that's pretty useful, and it's got all the advantages that I just talked about with grids, except it does things in a slightly different way. So if we've got our content in a separate block, we might have it stored inside an article, so an article and some headings and paragraphs, so nice semantic content there, useful for people using screen readers and search engines. And then we might have a bunch of completely unsemantic divs for putting our content into, for flowing it into. Then what we use is these properties here. We say, okay, I want the content that's inside my content class element to be flowed into an intermediary, which I've called article. So article is kind of our intermediary step, which the content is stored into. And then we use flow from to say, okay, I want to flow it out of article, and I want to stick it into all of these different divs, which I've specified here with their classes. And it's great because it allows you to do stuff like this. So I'll just show you this in the browser again. As I say, only in Chrome Canary at the moment. So you can do stuff like that. and I can't really show you on this because it's a bit too narrow, but as this container would get wider and narrower, so therefore the child elements would get wider and narrower because I've specified them as a percentage width of the parent element, the content will just flow between them as appropriate. So it's very, very flexible. And then at the bottom, I've just got an overflow div to stick all the stuff in that doesn't get into those free boxes. So that's kind of cool. So next we'll look at exclusions and shapes, which is another very interesting module brought to us by those fantastic people at Adobe. They really have contributed some awesome stuff to the web standards arena since Flash got a bit poorly. So exclusions, the idea here is basically that it allows us to create really, really complex floats. It's very, very poorly implemented in both Chrome Canary and IE at the moment. You can't really play with this one yet, but I'll just explain the basics anyway. So it allows us to do stuff like this. I'm sure you've all seen this picture at some point around the internet. This has been included in so many tutorials and examples. So what we do is, if we have something like this, we can say, okay, we've got an article here with a header inside it, and I'm going to absolutely position that header so that it sits over the top of my article. It's just sat over the top, and obviously if it's absolutely positioned, it's going to have some content hidden behind it. But if we use the wrap flow property, we basically say, okay, all of that content that's sat behind the absolutely positioned element, it's just going to go and just flow around it rather than being sat behind it. And this has got various different values that are usable. So in these pictures, which I've stolen straight from the spec, if you include wrap flow both, it basically says, okay, the content's going to wrap around both sides of the exclusions. Start, it will just wrap around the start. End, it will just wrap around the end. Minimum and maximum basically say it will choose whatever configuration gives you the minimum or the maximum amount of stuff wrapping around. And then clear keeps the actual lines the exclusions are on completely clear. So that's cool. But you can also shape the exclusions as well. You can use standard SVG functions to make polygons and rectangles, or you can even use the shape of a background image to exclude your content around, which is how you can end up with something like that. But the way that works is you've got shape inside and shape outside. So basically shape inside allows you to shape the inside of your exclusion, and shape outside allows you to give a shape to the outside. So you really can have some content flowing around some really interesting, complicated shapes. So again, a very, very cool idea. This is pretty much going to allow us to create all of those crazy floated magazine layouts that you see on the web, which means Adobe can keep making money out of InDesign, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any of my examples to work because a few properties are implemented in IE10 and then different properties are implemented in Chrome Canary. So hopefully we will get there. I mean, you might be sitting there thinking, well, why is it useful to tell me about something you can't even test yet? Well, it's interesting to see what's coming up, and then as this stuff does become testable, it's always useful to start playing with it early as real-world designers and developers and students, because then you can start giving feedback to the actual people writing the specs to say, hey, well, this sucks, this could work a bit better, that doesn't make sense, and they can actually make improvements to the specs early on, which usually doesn't happen. Usually the stuff arrives too late, so it's good to be able to grasp this stuff nice and early. So I was also going to just mention some of the new units coming up in the CSS specs. The REM unit is very cool. I use this literally all the time in my projects now. This is just the same as an M, except that when you size something using rems, it's always relative to the size of the font on the root element, which is, of course, pretty much always HTML. So that's really cool because it means it gets rid of all of these horrible, complicated mathematical equations you've got to do to work out, you know, oh, well, if this is nested 3 levels deep and the font size of the parent is this much, how many M's do I need to make this 12 pixels computed value? Ooh, about 0.873412, and it just gets really stupid. So it's much better to always be able to say, you know, I'll set a font size of 10 pixels on the HTML element, and then you'll be able to say, when I set one rem, that will always be 10 pixels. You know, it's much better. It's supported across all modern browsers, but it's not supported in old versions of IE, so IE 8 and below. But again, it's quite easy to get around because you could always have a separate style sheet inside a conditional comment and just basically say, okay, I'll just include pixel width sizings inside there. So fairly easy to deal with, really. But then there's also these ones. These are a bit less widely supported across browsers at the moment, but VH, VW, and VMin. And these actually allow you to size stuff relative to the size of the viewport itself, which is absolutely fantastic. So 1 VW is equivalent to 1% of the viewport width, 1 VH, 1% of the viewport height, and 1 VMin is whichever one of those is the smallest. And just as a really simple example, you can do things like this. So I'll just show you this in the browser because you can't really see it from the static image. But so I've got an example here, and most of my important bits of text are sized using VW. And as you can see, as the screen gets smaller, it just decreases the size proportionately to the viewport width. And that's absolutely brilliant for responsive design. It gets rid of a lot of these worries about having to go, okay, I need to include a media query here because at this point my H1 wraps onto a new line and completely breaks all of my design, and it's just fabulous. It's really cool. There was a jQuery plugin called fittext.js, which was written by the guys at Paravel Inc. over in Texas, that effectively does the same thing, but of course that requires you to attach jQuery to your page, which is rarely a good thing in my opinion. So it's fantastic that soon we'll be able to do that natively. It's supported across a lot of browsers, IE10, Firefox, well, newest Firefox, Chrome allegedly, although it didn't seem to work for me, and apparently iOS and BlackBerry also have it now, so that's quite interesting. So for the last section, let's look at fallbacks and alternatives. I'm sure a lot of you have probably been looking at this talk and thinking to yourself, I've got a bad feeling about this. Because, you know, a lot of this stuff doesn't degrade very gracefully. You know, a lot of CSS stuff does degrade gracefully if you think about stuff like box shadows and text shadows and rounded corners and all of that kind of stuff. That stuff does degrade gracefully as long as you just make sure that you include something like a solid background color if your gradient doesn't appear, to make sure that your text is readable and things like that. But it's pretty simple to work around those kind of problems. But yeah, layout stuff doesn't degrade gracefully. You know, if you've got this nice complicated flexbox layout and your browser doesn't support it, it's just going to completely fall to pieces and look terrible. So, but do we sit there and just wait until support is everywhere and all of the old versions of IE go away, which they won't for a very long time? I'd say no, because there are ways for us to build in intelligent alternatives via feature detection. Not browser detection, that's terrible and evil, but feature detection. So they're even working on a native feature detection mechanism. There's a supports at rule. And this is cool because it allows you to basically say, you know, you use the at supports at rule, and what it's doing is it's saying, if the display flex property is supported, then apply these CSS rules to the page. So inside your at supports block, you could include some sort of nice complex flexbox layout, but by default, just provide a basic floated layout. And then you can do the same sort of complexity with supports as you can with media queries. You could have commas to basically say, you know, if display flex is supported, or display WebKit flex, or display Moz flex, so you know, you could deal with the problem of having to support all of the different vendor prefix versions of the property as well. And you could also do at supports, display flex, and something else, you know, so you can have the and or stuff just like you can inside media queries. Of course, there is a bit of a problem here, of course. What if you're a modern browser that does support Flexbox, but you don't support supports? That's a bit of a problem, but you know, I think it'll be a while towards this is truly useful because of that. It's not much good if the actual feature detection mechanism itself isn't supported, but hey, I think for the moment, it's much better to stick with good old Modernizer. Who here has used Modernizer in a project? Show of hands. Okay, a few of us. So, for those that haven't, Modernizer is absolutely brilliant. It's a JavaScript library that allows you to do feature detection. You attach the JavaScript to your page, and you put a class of Node.js on your HTML element, and then at runtime, Modernizer goes through, performs a whole shed load of feature detection tests, and the two things it does is it gives you all of these classes on your HTML element, and these are basically the results of the feature detection tests. So Flexbox means this browser does support Flexbox. No CSS transforms 3D means this browser does not support 3D CSS transforms, and so on and so on. And it also gives you a Modernizer object inside JavaScript that you can use to query these feature detect results inside JavaScript as well. And you can do things like this. So for my regions example, I decided, well, it might be interesting to play with seeing if it's a good technique to, have the regions layout like I showed you before. So let's just show you that. Again, there's my regions layout. But then how about trying to make it so that in browsers that don't support regions, we can just have a simple 2-column layout instead. And that's great because Modernizer now has a regions feature detect. So what I've done here is I've said, okay, for my layout containers, if the browser doesn't support regions and therefore has the feature no regions class appended to the HTML element, I can use descendant selectors to say, only in that case, apply these particular rules. So in that case, I'm setting all of those layout containers, those non-semantic divs, to display none. Display none is normally a bit of a dirty word, but in this case, it really doesn't matter because there's no accessible content inside there anyway. And then, in this case, take the content container, my semantic, nice content container that I had my content in that was being flowed into the regions, and just give that a simple floated layout instead. So this is pretty cool as a technique for regions fallbacks. And you can do the same thing with Flexbox as well. Modernizer has a Flexbox flag, but it also has a legacy Flexbox flag too. So it actually tells you whether your browser supports modern Flexbox and legacy 2009 Flexbox syntax. So you can make this as granular as you want. You can say, okay, I'll use the modern Flex properties for browsers that do support Flexbox. I'll use the legacy properties for browsers that support the Flexbox 2009 legacy properties. And I'll just use something a bit simpler for browsers that don't support either of those. So that's cool. And then Modernizer.js works in a very similar way. You've got this Modernizer object, and you basically say, if Modernizer CSS animations and Modernizer.css transforms 3D, so that's basically saying, if the browser does support CSS animations and does support 3D transforms, run this code. Else, run something else. And in this particular example, I did this. Let's just show you this. Think I've got time? Yeah. Okay, so in browsers that do support, this is just basically a form that I've hidden off the side of the screen. And when I click the heading, I'm appending a class which has a CSS animation on it to the form element. And I'm doing the same. I'm toggling the two when I do in and out. So that's kind of a cool technique. And then also the submit button. When I submit the form, it appends a class to the form which has an animation that just makes it do a nice flip to give you a thank you message. And that works pretty well. But in a browser such as Opera Presto that doesn't support 3D transforms, that works absolutely fine. But using those Modernizer classes, I've basically said, so if the browser doesn't support CSS animations and 3D transforms, instead of appending that class and trying to make it run that CSS animation, just increase the Z index of the backface massively so it just appears. And that works all right. It doesn't look as elegant or as stylish, but at least it works. Okay, so that just about gets to the end of my talk. I'm giving you a very subtle advertisement here. Please buy my book because I'm a starving author. I haven't been able to buy my kids any diapers for several weeks, and it's getting really messy. And thank you for listening, folks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Perhaps we have some questions for Chris from the audience.
Hi. I have a question over the top, of course.
Okay.
We talk about future technologies in website layouts, and my question is, what do you think about using WebGL to make websites more 3D-like view? What's your opinion about it? Because we heard that there are many problems with security in this technology. So what's your opinion about that? Is it good? We should try to make our websites more 3D like in, I don't know, Iron Man movie, where there are super fancy interfaces.
Well, I've seen, I don't know a huge amount about WebGL because it's very hard, and I'm not very clever, but I've seen some very good uses of WebGL. I mean, I'm not a fan of using Canvas-based stuff to do entire interfaces because, of course, Canvas has major accessibility problems. There still isn't any DOM there, so therefore screen reader users are just totally out of luck in terms of being able to access the content inside those. But I do think it's definitely worthwhile using WebGL alongside a solid base of HTML and CSS to actually provide further enhancements. I mean, I've seen some really cool sites that use WebGL for some interesting animations and transitions to different parts of the site and stuff like that. And of course, in browsers that don't support WebGL, you could just provide something simpler instead. So I think that's perfectly reasonable. So yeah, as long as it's accessible, kids.
Thanks. Do you have any more questions?
What do you think about CSS frameworks? Because we use it and it's great for responsive design. Do you think we will use them in the future much more than clear CSS?
CSS what, sorry? What was the feature you were talking about?
CSS frameworks, like Twitter Bootstrap.
I still didn't catch it, I'm really sorry.
Twitter Bootstrap.
Oh, Bootstrap.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I think I don't really have much of an opinion on it, to be honest. I think they're perfectly okay to use, but yeah, sorry. But yeah, fine.
Anything else?
I suppose one problem I've had with some Bootstrap stuff is it seems to add a lot of weight to the page to do simple things. I think you should definitely consider whether you need all that stuff. Yeah. Anyway, let's go with the next question. Hello.
Hello. You said that including jQuery is rarely a good idea, and could you elaborate on that?
Okay. I suppose it's because I spend a lot of my time considering how to make web pages as small as possible so that they're more useful for people on very limited bandwidth and very old mobile phones and things like that. So I don't know. I mean, I think jQuery is a good idea if you have a lot of things that you want to do with it. And of course, it's also got the advantage that it abstracts away a lot of the cross-browser problems. So there's definitely good reasons to use it, but I don't use it that much because I don't see very much reason to. So it was a bit of a jokey comment, really. I think there are definitely good ways to use jQuery, but myself, I hardly ever use it, so that was it. Okay, any more questions? At the front there?
Thank you. So I've got a question about specification, because when you told about the Flexbox and the other stuff which will come, will it be in the CSS3 specification, or will it be the next CSS specification?
Oh, good question. So the way that CSS currently works, as you probably know, is it's split up into these different modules, and strictly speaking, there is no such thing as CSS3. If you look at the actual wording on the specifications, it always says Flexbox, it says CSS Flexbox, module level 3, so it's level 3 of CSS. But basically that's what we call CSS3, is all of these modules that say level 3 on them. Flexbox in particular, as it is now, is going to be part of CSS3, or the level 3 series of modules, because it's now in candidate recommendation stage in terms of a specification, and that basically means that it's pretty much finished and is unlikely to change anymore, if at all. There are others that are in a bit more of a changeable state. So grids, for example, as I said with grids, IE10 has implemented grids, but then the syntax went and changed about 2 months after they did that. So it's a good idea to be careful at what stage you implement your different specs. There is already work being done on CSS4, level 4 specifications. So, for example, CSS selectors level 4, and there's a level 4 media queries specification as well, which includes some more interesting media query stuff, such as luminosity media queries and script media queries and touch media queries. So I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you always look at it and go, well, there's all this stuff in level 3, and now people are talking about level 4, and I haven't even learned level 3 yet. But I wouldn't worry too much about it, really. The level 4 stuff is way off, and even when you do get a level 3 module, such as Flexbox, which is pretty much finished and complete and isn't going to change anymore, any further ideas that they then want to add to that technology will then be put into the level 4 version, which is going to be a long time off before that's completed. I hope that answers your question anyway. Possibly a bit more detail than you really wanted, but never mind.
Okay, I think that will be our last question.
Last question.
Hi, at the beginning. I got a quick question because basically right now there are some add-ons for CSS for doing simple math and so on, like SCSS, basically for adding variables and doing simple math on some parameter. And my question is, why don't you add that kind of simple function and mathematic functions to CSS?
Oh, you're talking about things like calc, and is that what you mean, like the sort of arithmetic functions inside CSS? Is that what we mean? Right. I think it's quite a good idea in some cases. So I think calc is a good idea, because the idea of the calc function is for people that don't know, it basically sort of says, okay, if you want to, if you've got two things that, if you've got two things that are sized using different units, you can then sort of use calc to basically say, okay, I'll give a single unit at the end of the calculation that will work. So stuff like that is a good idea. I'm not sure how much further we should extend it, really. I'm not sure if we should start putting things like mix-ins into CSS, although I think we should probably leave those to the realm of things like SAS and less, because they work very well for things like that. For example, if you want to create a much easier way to write a property that requires all of the prefixes on different lines, you can just write a SAS mix-in that will do it all for you, and you just have to write one line. So that's really, really good. But I'm not sure if we should start turning CSS into JavaScript too much, because that's what some people want. So, but yeah, I think a limited amount is okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. Dziękujemy za wszystkie pytania.